Dr. Jaishankar, I want to start by asking you about how the Russia-Ukraine conflict seems to be posing the biggest challenge to India's presidency as the G20. How are you trying to overcome this global geopolitical conflict, which seems to be tearing apart any plan you may have to show the G20 and India's presidency as a massive success? How are you batting on this dangerous pitch?
First of all, Rahul, let me say it's a great pleasure to be back. At Indo, first you got to manage the curator, okay, to make sure that you don't have that much turn in the pitch that early. I think we did a decent job in two meetings so far, the finance ministers meeting and the foreign ministers meeting. How do we manage? To me, it's not just a question of managing the big geopolitical divide right now. It's a question of getting the G20 to go back to its original mandate. The G20 was invented to look at global development, to look at global growth, to address challenges to it. And what we saw last year was that that entire agenda got sidetracked by the Ukraine conflict and the debates that accompanied it. It was a particular concern for us because the consequences of the Ukraine conflict have actually aggravated what is already a very distressed global situation. You had the COVID, you had even pre-COVID, you had issues of debt which were increasing. So the energy spike, the food shortages, the fertilizer problems, these are actually big concerns of much of the world. But when you looked at the G20 for the last year, these concerns were peripheral. You could say understandably, the focus was entirely on the Ukraine conflict. So our first effort is really to get the G20 refocused on what it should be, its mandate. I think we succeeded in large measure in both the meetings which have issued documents so far. We were able to get a very, very substantial agreement. For example, in the foreign ministers one, there were 24 paragraphs, and many of these global concerns, health, debt, finance, even terrorism, counter-narcotics, all these we had agreement on. What we did not have agreement was on the issue of whether the Bali consensus, which was forged last November, in which we had a role as well, whether the Bali consensus could be rolled over for this year. And here, the Russians and the Chinese took a view that they would not agree to that. So what we did was we actually produced a hybrid document, you could say, which was a chairman's summary for those two paragraphs and an outcome for the rest of the document.
But your opponents in politics and quite a few diplomats have highlighted the absence of a joint communique, saying that oftentimes the success of a summit is determined by the outcome which is laid out in the joint communique. Given that you didn't have one in the finance ministers meeting and then in the foreign affairs meeting, your opponents will have their swords out saying Jaishankar has failed, India has failed, that nothing really came out of this G20 presidency except a chairman summary. How do you view this?
Chairman summary and an outcome document. That's what it's called.
How do you view this concern around because the same challenge could potentially persist to September, which is when G20 heads of state come to India for the leaders summit?
Look, opponents will have the swords out no matter what, especially in our current state of politics. But if you look at it in a more informed basis, which opponents rarely do look at the Indonesian presidency. They actually went through a series of chairman summary till the very end, where finally with our collective efforts, we were able to get a Bali declaration. So if you're asking me how am I doing with respect to that, I've actually got a chairman summary and an outcome document. I've got out of a document of 24 paragraphs, I've got agreement on 22. So I would say in the given circumstance, I'm frankly doing as well as anybody can do. Now, you have people, you see, unfortunately, or you could say this is part of being in opposition. You can take positions which have no sense of realism, no sense of responsibility, as though a very serious conflict requires a diplomatic event in Delhi to be breached. There's a much bigger problem going on in Ukraine. The problem is not going to be sorted out in a conference in Delhi. The problem is going to be sorted out out there on, in Ukraine. So I think it's a non-serious proposition you're making.
What are you hoping, Foreign Minister, would be India's legacy from this G20 presidency? There's a lot of commentary in the West about how seriously India is taking this G20 presidency. What are you hoping will be the lasting imprint?
Look, you are wanting me to predict not just a match, but a whole series ahead of time.
That's right.
I honestly cannot say where we would be in September. Obviously, I would be optimistic. I would try my best. If I were to look at what is already visible, we were the first country who actually consulted much of the world that is not on the table at the G20 about their expectations of the G20. Nobody else has done this. So what Prime Minister Modi did through the Voice of Global Summit, Global South Summit, we actually asked 125 countries, saying, look, what is it you want? What is it you feel which is not getting through? What should we be doing on your behalf? Nobody else has done that exercise. So today, actually, much of the world says, we have India there batting for us, that our concerns are going to be on the table, our voice will be heard, and I would say, I would certainly hope one big legacy, and I'm confident of that, would be to make G20 much more true to its global mandate. The G20 should not be a debate, I would say a debating club or an arena only of the global north. That the entirety of global concerns need to be captured. I think we have already made that point very, very forcefully. Now, what else comes out of it? At the moment, people are very, very seriously discussing issues like green financing. They're discussing how do we get the Agenda 2030 back on track. They are looking at issues which, range from terrorism financing, counter-narcotics. So there's a big agenda out there.
There's been some commentary internationally about how India and Prime Minister Modi could have a role to play in trying to work out some kind of a rapprochement or a truce between Russia and Ukraine. In the real world, how feasible is this? Is this something that the Indian government is trying to work towards?
In the real world, you don't predict, and you definitely do not predict publicly. So I won't really give you a more specific response on that, but I do want you to note something. At this time, there are very concrete, I would say, specific issues which have arisen from the Ukraine conflict. Wherever there's a possibility for us to contribute, we have tried to do so. I'll give you two examples. When we were at Bali, the Turkish foreign minister actually brought up with me the problems they were having at that time with Russia on the Black Sea grain corridor. And he felt that my speaking to Lavrov would be very helpful. And I did. Okay, it may have made a 1%, 2%, 5% difference, I don't know. But in some way, we could help. When I was in Ukraine, at that time, when I was in New York, the Ukrainian Prime Minister actually met me and had some concerns about the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And he wanted certain issues to be conveyed to the Russians. So I got PM's okay to do that, and then went and, did that with Lavrov. And then there were some consequent issues that we brought up with IAEA, with the Director General Grossi. So wherever we can help, we will. Now, whether the time is ripe for something bigger, is there actually the possibility, are the parties willing to look at returning to the negotiating table? Because at the end of the day, that is what is essential. That, I think, is still a very open question.
Now, this is a year where potentially President Xi Jinping could be coming to India twice over, once for the SCO summit in mid-June, then potentially in September. I want your thoughts, Foreign Minister, on India's most important relationship with the neighbor across the Himalayas. What's your reading of the current state of play with China, given the continuing confrontation in the Depsang and Demchok sectors of the line of actual control?
This is a very, I would say, challenging and abnormal phase in our ties with China. Why I say that is because from 1988, when Rajiv Gandhi went there, till 2020, the understanding was that peace and tranquility on the border would be maintained. We had two agreements not to bring large forces to the border. It was a very specific set of understandings. There were even protocols on what happens when army patrols meet each other, etc. Now, in 2020, the Chinese violated that. And they violated that, and the consequences of that we saw in Galwan and in other areas as well. Now, we have deployed our troops, we have stood our ground, and the situation, to my mind, still remains very fragile because there are places where our deployments are very close up. And, in military assessment, actually, therefore, quite dangerous. Now, we have made substantial progress when it comes to disengagement in many areas. There are still some areas where we have ongoing discussions. So they will, it's a painstaking job, we will do that. Now, we have made it very clear to the Chinese that we cannot have a breach of peace and tranquility. You can't violate agreements and then want the rest of the relationship to continue as though nothing happened. That's just not tenable. So my most recent encounter in this regard was with the new foreign minister, Chingang, in fact, when the foreign ministers' G20 meeting took place. And we had a long discussion about it. In September 2020, Wang Yi and I had an in-principle agreement how we're going to resolve it. So the Chinese have to deliver on what was agreed to. And they have struggled with that.
Why?
Well, that's a question you need to ask them. I can't answer it because for me it's very clear-cut. Until these problems are sorted out, we will not return to a normal relationship. I want to make that very, very clear.
Your opponents say that you're not being totally honest about the extent of incursion, that areas where the Indian Army used to patrol previously have been denied, landmass in excess of 1,000 square kilometers being spoken of. They're saying this is a daylight robbery of our land. The PLA has intruded into our country. Dr. Jaishankar is not telling the people the truth.
These are the same opponents who said, let's leave the border undeveloped so that the Chinese can't come? Or if they come in, they can't come in so fast? These are the same opponents? Okay. Now, let's look at the reality. Look, the reality is wherever an attempt has been made to change the status quo, the Indian Army has deployed and countered. Now, it is because of that there has been face-offs and standoffs, and on some occasions, clashes and loss of lives. If we had done nothing, then Galwan wouldn't have happened. Then, what you saw in December at Yangtze in Arunachal wouldn't have happened. So, the fact that, there have been counter deployments is not disputed by anybody unless you are an opponent. Okay? So, in terms of what is it you are patrolling, yes, there are certain places where we have is something which Rajnath Ji, the defense minister, has spoken about in Parliament. that you have mutually agreed areas of temporary non-patrolling in order to facilitate disengagement. So if there are places I cannot patrol, there are places the Chinese also cannot patrol. Now, so this is something which has been worked out in certain areas where the deployments were very, very close up. But do remember also, this is quite different from what used to happen before. Because if you looked at our history, you know, people forget in Barahoti in the 1950s, in 1958, we unilaterally decided on a demilitarized zone. They didn't reciprocate. In the 1970s, there are areas we chose not to patrol, unilaterally. Even when Sumdurongchu, Wangdung was resolved, we first came down. This government is very different. There's nothing unilateral. You know, if we have today taken on some I would say, commitment, that commitment is matched by an equal commitment based on the principle of equal and mutual security on the Chinese side. So, look, opponents will play this game because the very people who actually neglected the border, you know the border infrastructure budget till 2014 was below 4,000 crores. Today it's almost 15,000 crores. You look at road building, you know, the pace of road building has doubled or tripled. Tunneling has tripled. So the people who are today making a noise are people, I mean, and you should look at the record.
Speaking of opponents...
No, hang on.
Oh, yes.
In 2013, I was ambassador in China, okay? You remember there was, I think I spoke to you at that time, there was a Chinese incursion in Depsang. Do you remember what the foreign minister of the day said then? He said, this is acne on the face of a beautiful relationship, and therefore we should not worry about it. So now you're telling me these people have suddenly discovered what's the importance of the border? I mean, come on.
Speaking of opponents, Rahul Gandhi, speaking in West London, the United Kingdom, said that you're scared of China, that the foreign minister says China is much more powerful than us, how can I pick a fight with them? At the heart of his ideology is cowardice, and then he goes back to the times of the British to say that the RSS never fought, and this is really the mentality that's seeped down. How do you respond to Mr. Gandhi?
Okay. You know, I'm actually reminded, because first we are talking about Rahul Gandhi speaking about China abroad. I'm reminded of a very different experience I had in 2011. This was the first time I met Narendra Modi. He was then the opposition chief minister of Gujarat, very much under attack at that time, political attack in India. He comes to China. I'm the ambassador. And he asked me for a briefing on our problems with China, and we're having a problem. You know, we had the staple visa issue, we had the Northern Command issue, there were a whole set of issues. So I told him that you're the first chief minister who's ever asked for a national security briefing. I'm curious to know why. To which he said, look, I'm an opposition chief minister. I have come to China. I do not want to say anything which is 1 millimeter other than my national position. And I have to be very careful. So I first need to fully understand from you. And two, at the meeting, if you see me deviating in any way, you know, signal me. I'm reminded of this because when I saw what happened in 2011 and I see what's happening today, I look at the contrast. Now your question. Look, I also, like many others, followed some of what Rahul Gandhi said when he was in UK. Obviously, look, a lot of it is politics. I'm putting that aside. Okay? There's a discount when it comes to politics. I am troubled as a citizen of India. I'm troubled as a citizen of India when I see somebody drooling over China and being dismissive about India. And I'll give you examples. he puts his description suo moto of China in that Cambridge talk. You know, what's the word which comes to his mind when he talks of China? Harmony. His one-word description of China is harmony. His one-word description of India is discord. Okay. He talks admiringly of how China is the greatest manufacturer, nobody can. And yes, China has done a tremendous job. I mean, nobody. But when it comes to manufacturing in India, he runs it down in every possible way. He says, make in India won't work. I mean, when you made Covaxin, the Congress party was saying Covaxin doesn't work. So, you know, it's one, look, you can have objective assessments about the progress of other countries. There's nothing wrong with that. But in this current situation, to talk up, you know, a competitive relationship and to worse, do down your own country, you're telling me I'm scared. I'm asking you, you know, why is somebody undermining national morale like this? And it's not just, you know, economy. Let's even look at security. He talks about connectivity. He speaks admiringly in the same talk. He's spoken about the Belt and Road. He compares, very poetically I must say, he compares Belt and Road like the yellow river in China gushing forth. Guys, the Belt and Road goes through POK. It violates our national integrity and sovereignty. He doesn't have a word to say about it. So I think, you know, when, to use Dr. Pillsbury's term, when panda huggers try to be China hawks, it doesn't fly.
Interesting. Now that you've mentioned Michael Pillsbury, I want to refer to a few things from his book. If you heard some parts of his session at the India Today Conclave yesterday, he spoke of how he would have expected, given what's happened in the warring states in the past, that there be a much stronger response from countries like the Quad to develop a countervailing force to a rising superpower. That the Quad is still very loosely formed, doesn't have any definition in terms of a strategic military alliance, even if it's not a formal alliance, but a more robust opposition to a rising superpower, that the world is allowing China to rise without coming together to stop it more purposefully.
I watched that session. It was a very interesting session. But pause for a moment on Quad, and I want to take you back to the previous question. Today, I heard from your words, opponents, how we should stand up to China. Do you remember that first time we tried the Quad was in 2007? And do you remember what happened to that Quad? And how much we stood up to China at that point of time? So what's the difference? Today you have a Quad because this government has frankly, the guts to stand up on Quad. 2007, we didn't. We buckled. So coming to Quad, I would say, you know, this is not about statements because, you know, does somebody explicitly mention a country or not. It's not, you know, it shouldn't really be seen through the prism of treaties and alliances. To my mind, that's old thinking. This is a different world. And we are not a country, for reasons of our history, who do that, you know. Treaties and alliances is part very much of a post-Second World War, Cold War kind of framework. Today, I think the global situation calls for countries with converging interests who have a great deal of comfort with each other, working together in an area or a domain which they find themselves comfortable. In the case of Quad, that happens to be primarily the Indo-Pacific. And then developing, you know, what are called habits of cooperation. And I think if you see, from the time the Quad was revived, because 2007, the Quad was kind of aborted, it took a decade for it to be revived. 2017, it started as at the foreign secretary's level. I happened to be foreign secretary at that time. 19, it became foreign minister's level. I happened to be foreign minister at that time too. And 21, it met at the prime minister president's level. Today, the fact that it meets, the agenda is growing. Each meeting is actually broadening the areas of cooperation. So I feel it is moving well, precisely because it is flexible, it is nimble, it is creative, it gets top-up attention. What I would not like to see is, I would not like to see it becoming bureaucratic, rigid, where it becomes legalistic. People spend more time quarreling about, does this conform to that article or not? That's not the way we are thinking at all.
I'm also very curious, and can I have a mic sent across to Dr. Pillsbury, please, about his theory that China is winning the 100-year marathon and that it won't take till 2049 for President Xi to take China to being the preeminent superpower of the world, that Dr. Pillsbury thinks this could happen in the mid-2030s, and that this is the new reality of a China-led world order. As Foreign Minister of India, Dr. Jaishankar, what do you think of this?
I heard him. I also had the pleasure of spending some time with him this morning. Definitely, in the case of China, I mean, no question, China is today the number 2 power in terms of its size, in terms of its ability. Yes, there are sectoral areas where it may be even better than that, and I think he gave some examples of it yesterday. I look perhaps in a more detached, objective way. He's an American looking at China. He's a China specialist looking at China. And we've known each other for 40 years. I have great respect and regard for his understanding and his experience with China. I am today an Indian looking at the world. I'm looking at both US and China and a lot of other factors, together. I don't think, it's a binary situation. I don't think the world anymore can be analyzed in terms of a binary competition. I accept that, that these are, looking at them, that US is still number 1 and China today, you could say in many ways, follows thereafter. But I think the situation is much more complex. There are many more variables. I am, as a student of history, I'm quite reserved in my judgments about the future, where they go, how they happen. And I come back actually to the theme of your meeting today, the India moment. Because, and I would actually, rather than moment, say the moment is the batsman has just taken the crease or just a little while ago. I think there's a full innings to be played. That innings is called Amrit Kal. It's a 25-year innings which is to be played. I think we have today set ourselves up. We have set ourselves up not just by foreign policy moves, because you have to do the deep domestic changes which are necessary for the rise of a power. China did that. Had our opponents done what they should have done during that tenure, we would be in a very different position. We don't have the deep industrial strengths, the deep technology strengths of China, because that kind of thinking was never there. If you look from, leave alone the 1970s and 80s, which were a disaster economically. You look even after the 1990s, where was the focus on building deep strengths? Instead we went for globalization mantras. So my point is, my takeaway from what he said, and from his books and from our many conversations from him, countries have to build deep strengths if they have to have global aspirations. Today, Make in India, Atmanirbhar Bharat, the kind of things we are doing, even improving human resources, skills, educations, nutrition, all this is part of a metrics.
Dr. Pillsbury, you spoke of China's rise to the top of the world by the middle of the next decade. Dr. Jaishankar, Prime Minister Modi, and the Indian government are working towards what they call Amrit Kal, the rise of India to the top. How do you square these two things off, given the fact that you're estimating China will rise, and many like Morgan Stanley are thinking that India is witnessing a once-in-a-generation rise in global power? Dr. Pillsbury.
You know, I would say that the world is watching the India moment. The Indian political leadership has within its hands the chance to be sure that the world is not ruled by a dominant number one, China. In many ways, it's up to India to decide what to do. And it's very scary, if I could use that word, to see Rahul Gandhi's comments about China. We have a few people in America who think the way Rahul Gandhi apparently thinks about China, that harmony is the key feature of that country. Almost all those people, the old Panda huggers, they have changed their minds. They have come alive. They realize there's a global challenge from China. And if you carefully read Dr. Jaishankar's book, The India Way, you will see in there his proposal that India should play a shaping role in the global order, partly as a voice for the global South, but for other reasons as well. The reaction in China to Dr. Jaishankar's book is very negative. They don't like the idea that India could play a role speaking for the global South. They believe that's China's responsibility. So this challenge for the future of the India-China relationship, that's something I wish I had devoted more time to many years ago. But I now see India as the world's chance to be sure that China does not become a dominant, aggressive, and dictatorial society.
That's interesting. I also see we have a bit of a mutual admiration club here. Dr. Pillsbury, when he came yesterday, carried Dr. Jaishankar's book, The India Way. And I just heard from Dr. Jaishankar before we started the session that in the last several years, he's probably gifted more copies of your book than anybody else. So you got a good representative here because he wants people to read what you're writing. In fact, the very interesting thing, and I want to refer to some parts of The India Way.
We need to give both the books to Rahul Gandhi.
Now, the very interesting thing about The India Way, and I refer to this just for those who haven't had the opportunity to read Dr. Jaishankar's book, is that you have a theorist, you have a strategic affairs expert who's also shaping India's foreign policy. And so much of what I grew up reading, and so many other people would have read Western thought or Chinese thought, but you're not really linking back the strategic acumen from the Arthashastra, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and bringing it to an Indian doctrine, an Indian strategic way of thinking, which is what Dr. Jaishankar tries to do. So, and it's also a great opportunity to engage and debate and challenge you to some questions about balance of power. In the US, elsewhere, Russia, Beijing, there's a lot of thought on balance of power. And national security doctrines are well documented, public documents which can be debated and discussed. In India, it stays largely within cupboards in South Bloc. It's not public. I want your assessment, Dr. Jaishankar, about India's comprehensive national power at this moment and your projection of the climb. If you were to rank countries, where do you think India stands at this moment in terms of its comprehensive national power? Where do you see it by the end of this decade?
You know, first of all, I just want to pick up a little bit on what you were saying, which is to develop our own, draw on our own traditions, you know, develop our own narratives, arguments, etc. Because when you speak about comprehensive national power, I mean, in a sense, there are a certain set of metrics that we take, and I think nobody would dispute the fact that there are many areas, many domains where we have fallen short. We could have done very much better over many years. And I see today, you know, this country, I say, I mean, not necessarily this government, doesn't have to be a political party. This entire country actually today making that effort. You know, as someone who travels around, you know, for me, It's a very small change, but a very important change I see. When you go to many educational institutions today in India, I go as a minister, they would normally say, this is the gold medalist of our university. Today, they actually say, you know, these 4 people, they are patent holders from our institution. These 5 people, you know, they have inventions they would like to show you. So this country, this society is changing, the younger generation even more so. And we are getting very, very global, much faster than people think. So I am finding, you know, before I came in here, your social media person asked me saying, you know, you are very visible on the social media. It's not because the foreign minister is doing something different alone. It's also because the society has changed and is relating and interacting with that in a very different way. Your question, where do we go? Look, I am absolutely, I think
Where do you stand at this moment? Let's start from there, in your estimate.
we stand fairly high because if you take the totality, the comprehensive national power is a kind of a net assessment of our capabilities. But I would say that if we do need today to develop the technologies, to develop the industrial capabilities, you know, it angers me when I hear talk that, you know, we are a services economy, because that's a cop-out. When I see, you know, something like, say, a 5G deployment of Indian technology, when we see, to speak about an India stack, when we look at an invented in India vaccine, you know, to me, these are the bellwethers of change. This is what will actually grow our comprehensive national power. When, you know, again, in defense, it's a domain you're very familiar with. You know, when we are stressing make in India and defense, we are ourselves discovering there's so much more that we actually were capable of producing. It's just that there was no policy, there was no pressure on us to produce. It was much easier to get it from outside. So, look, this decade for sure, I mean, it's a general expectation in the world that we would end up as the third most powerful nation by the end of the decade. That's the general global consensus. But as I said, I'm thinking an era. I mean, not I'm thinking an era. I think the country is thinking an era. That we are looking at a 25-year time frame. It's the first time, in fact, in this country that people are saying, let's think 25 years ahead. Let us plan for 25 years ahead. A lot of things we are doing today, you will not see the results even in 5 years or maybe 10 years. You will see it beyond that.
Given the fact that Russia and China are getting closer, we saw China play a role recently in trying to broker an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Is it inevitable, you think, that the world will be split into 2 camps? India will have to choose, most likely being with the United States? Or do you see India as a third pole in a country, in a world dominated by the United States and China?
I think we will see not just third poles, we will see multiple poles. We will see multiple poles, and when it comes to India-Russia, I put it to you that it is actually a uniquely stable relationship. I mean, if you were to say 1955, I take as the first inflection point. From the time when Russia committed, Soviet Union then committed itself on a very core issue of India's national security. Russia has been through tremendous ups and downs over this period. We have, our growth has been more organic and relatively uninterrupted. But through all of this, India-Russia relations have remained extraordinarily stable, and I put it to you, there is a deeper underlying convergence, a geopolitical convergence. No question, as a result of the Ukraine conflict, Russia will turn more towards Asia. Okay, I have no problem with that. But I would also suggest to you that when Russia turns more towards Asia, one part of that, a big part of that, will actually be visible in India-Russia relations, and that is already visible actually in trade. That our trade, in fact, has probably more than tripled in the last year, and it's not just oil. There are a lot of other things as well.
Will President Xi be coming to India?
You know, look, I'm the foreign minister. This is something you should ask his chief of protocol.
What's your sense? You would know.
No. I don't do programming. Or if I do programming, I do of my prime minister.
I have a question. I'm not sure of what he's going to say, but it's really a question that needs to be asked. And this is really about whether you think that the SCO summit in mid-year and the G20 summit provides an opportunity to push through disengagement along the line of actual control where we haven't been able to achieve disengagement. Thinking, just zooming out and thinking for a moment, it's very difficult for President Xi to come to India at a time when you're so publicly and openly saying that there is a massive problem along the line of actual control, our relationship isn't normal. Do you think that creates an opportunity to ensure that there is some kind of a true pullback?
You know, let's not mix apples and oranges here. Disengagement is primarily a military diplomatic process. It has to be so because it involves actually sitting with maps, looking at the topography, local military commanders discussing their dispositions and why that is so, and what it would mean if I pull back so much and you pull back so much. It's a very, very granular set of conversations that need to be had. It's a conversation which only, you know, what has been happening over the last 2 years is basically either at a for us a corps commander level or one below that, the military commanders with the diplomatic representatives, you know, in our case from the MEA, they sit and work this out. Don't confuse this with summits and visits. That's a different issue. But there is a larger issue, and the larger issue is this, that if the current state of affairs continues, relationships between us will not be normal. That is a reality.
You know,
and I think that reality is not lost on other people.
Saying this as openly and clearly as you are is really interesting and refreshing to see. I want to draw your attention to the new American ambassador who's been announced and confirmed, Eric Garcetti, and I want to quote to you what he said about the Citizenship Amendment Act. He was asked during the Senate Foreign Affairs Relations Committee meeting about the CA. Now, he's someone who's spoken up multiple times on human rights and discrimination, and he thinks the Citizenship Amendment Act is a core piece of his engagement rather than an obligation. He also says he will work because he thinks that this is discriminatory towards Muslims. Now, you will have soon in New Delhi, from arguably our most important strategic partner, a new ambassador who thinks a key legislation, which is core of your ideological agenda, is discriminatory towards Muslims.
You know, first of all, when CA was passed, there was a debate. People in this country tried to make it an international debate. And it was, it was interesting when I went around the world and I explained to different countries that please look at your citizenship criteria and tell me, are you less specific in terms of how you have defined the criteria than we have? Take the United States. There are two very well-known amendments there, something called the Lautenberg Amendment and the Specter Amendment, which actually single out specific communities and specific faiths and give them a faster pathway into citizenship. Not just those. I can cite to you in US, there's a Jackson-Vanik Amendment. There was one, if my memory serves me right, for the Hmong people. So, and this is not just the US. But if you look at Europe, the Germans have a faster citizenship pathway for people of German descent in other countries. There are other European countries who say, you speak my language, you have my faith, you have cultural characteristics.
But India doesn't have one faith.
No, sorry?
India doesn't have one faith.
Sure.
But therefore, the question is about him thinking of this being discriminatory towards Muslims.
No, the point is that in many cases, the people who are persecuted have nowhere else to go except to India. I mean, if you are a Hindu in Pakistan who's being oppressed, where else will you go other than India?
Okay.
So, I mean, look, somewhere, I mean, you should not subject common sense to political correctness. I mean, there is a certain reality here which all of us know. I mean, stares you in the face. But your question, what happens when he comes here? Let him come here. प्यार से समझा देंगे.
प्यार से समझा देंगे नए American ambassador को. So we're out of time. Ordinarily, a few years ago, if I was doing this session at the conclave, we would have spent a lot of time talking about Pakistan. We've come to the end of the session. We've not even mentioned the P word. Given what's happening in Pakistan at this moment, Foreign Minister, what's your reading of our relationship with our neighbor on the West?
Well, I think our relationship has not fundamentally changed. Today, our relationship is at a low ebb because they have not yet demonstrated a willingness to give up on cross-border terrorism as a primary way of dealing with India. So I think as they move away from that, one has to look at the possibilities.
You know, it's been very refreshing to have Foreign Minister Jaishankar explain his point of view and India's point of view, or the India way, going back to Indian scriptures and Indian streams of thought, as opposed to referring just very casually and easily to Western thought or even Chinese thought. And this, I think, is something which really needs to be worked on. Can we have a very warm round of applause as we thank the Foreign Minister for joining us?